Time for another video, and before we get started, a big thank you and shout out once again to everyone who has liked and subscribed so far. This is a channel dedicated to helping others improve as artists in the most efficient manner possible by leveraging research from cognitive fields like neuroscience, meta-learning, and autodidacticism. I recently passed 500 hours of trying to improve my painting and drawing skills by experimenting with meta-learning techniques like spaced repetition learning. I practice for just 1 hour per day with the area of study dictated by an algorithm that tells me what to work on using flashcards that I made from popular art books. You can see a little of each day's training session in my shorts feed where I post every day, including a short description. If you'd like to know more about the system and how it can benefit you, I have a video on screen now, and there's even a Discord server dedicated to it. The flashcards I use for this experiment are all captured from books which you can view in this video. This is not my first 500 hours of drawing as a total beginner, but most of my previous experience was with copying other drawings. I started out copying anime as a teen and got so frustrated at not being able to draw it from imagination that I started learning again from scratch. I also decided to learn to paint, and I am learning that as a total beginner. These last 100 hours were actually really quite different to the others, in that the lessons I felt I learned were mostly applicable to all aspects of art, both drawing and painting, and came in the form of big realisations. The biggest one was the interplay between working from observation and from imagination. So let's start there. As many of you know, my ultimate goal with this experiment is to really be able to both draw and paint things very well from my imagination, as good as artists like Kim Jung-gi or Tom Fox, or those who work for big game publishers like Riot. Because of this and the fact that most of these artists draw designed figures and scenery, I've spent most of my time working from imagination and learning by looking at a lot of theory. So elements like perspective or how to paint values using the 50% rule. My main sources for information have been things like books by Scott Robertson, and this is because I want to be able to draw things that exist in my head, not observed from reality. But in the last 100 hours, I decided to try and branch out more into things like portraiture and bark drawing that work much more from observation. And the weird thing about this has been the profound impact it's had on my imaginary work. By drawing real heads and real people, I've felt like I've incorporated things I've seen into drawing the imaginary ones, and I've come to the conclusion that both approaches are likely necessary to achieve the levels I wish to hit. By drawing from observation, I get to see the anatomy and simplified boxes or Loomis heads I've studied actually on a live model. And then when I draw the box or Loomis heads from imagination, I can think back to the real heads I have seen and might recall how an eye looked or the way the chin was. In other words, both approaches inform one another and create a synergy that causes each to power the other one up in turn. If you draw only from observation, you might end up very good at copying the lines and angles you see in reality, but when you try and recall them from imagination with no reference, you have no clue what it should look like, and this was my initial experience with drawing as a teenager. Conversely though, drawing purely from imagination and simplified forms and rules like I've been doing, where we perhaps draw a box and then divide its height into 4 and then plot out the features, leads to drawing the same exact head every time. There's no character or visual interest. It becomes an exercise in drawing a standardized form, which is fine, but only as a starting point. By combining both approaches, though, we reap the benefits of both. If I want to draw a head from imagination with no reference now, I can do it because, firstly, I know the simplified base version, such as might be used by Loomis, but also I can recall some of the things I have seen in the real world and incorporate those. It's early days, but this blending is actually probably the exact way that artists like Kim Jung-gi got to their high level of skill. When you try to draw something you've seen before with no reference, the details are foggy. This forces you to go back and observe it again and redraw it, focusing on a different thing each time. It's the exact same repetition model I'm already employing for learning, but instead of working purely on primitive forms, we're trying to recall realistic depictions of things, with details and character. And when we fail, we can go peek at the real thing and draw it some more, perhaps zoning in and focusing on something we feel our current efforts lack. I've been using this to try and address issues that commenters pick out frequently, such as errors with the far eye when I draw a 3/4 view of the head. This issue was likely caused by something very simple. I thought I understood the forms and anatomy of the head better than I actually did. I was drawing what I thought was right, but it was wrong. By observing and studying real heads, I can learn to get a feel for what things should really look like. But the hard part then becomes drawing what you actually see, not what you think you see. Otherwise, you're just applying your current mistakes to the real head you are observing. This means I'm currently having to unlearn things that I have spent time developing for the previous 400 hours. And that sucks, but I think it's probably quite a natural part of the learning process. Even Tiger Woods changed his golf swing once he became a professional. So to summarize, you should probably study some split between drawing real things and drawing things from your imagination and allow them to inform each other. When you observe something, be sure to include it the next time you draw your original character or anything else from imagination. And when you think you know what that anatomy should look like, draw it and then go look at a real human body to see how close you actually were. This back and forth process is now the approach I am actively testing. It's also made me question a few more things about my anatomy studies. Last time I was learning to draw things like the rib cage in a lot of detail and mentioned that you probably didn't need to bother because you'll never need that much detail anyway. I still think this is typically the case, but wanted to elaborate on the developments I've made by discussing a helpful LOD approach to learning anatomy. LOD stands for level of detail, and it's a concept used when 3D modeling assets for games. Artists might make a very big blocky version of an object, and then a more refined one, and finally a highly detailed version. Depending on how far you, as the player, are from the object, the 3D model will swap out, with lower levels of details being used for more distant objects. We can use a similar approach to learning to draw things like the human figure. I have 3 levels of detail that I currently use. When I start to learn a new piece of anatomy like the hips, I start with level 1, a simple box that proportionally contains the anatomy. This means you have to have the height, depth, and width of this box memorized and be able to draw it from any angle. From there, you can work on level 2, the planar version, and this is where you chip away faces on the box to make something harder to draw, but still ultimately just a primitive-like shape. I like to think of these as low-poly PlayStation 1 style graphics. These can be a little bit challenging to draw from certain angles, so remember to always draw through the forms as if they were ghosts, and to always consider your eye level. It's a good perspective workout. Level 3 is a much more realistic level of detail. Here we round the parts out to make them appear far more like the real anatomy they represent. The key thing to understand here, though, is that in terms of perspective, I still think very much about levels 1 and 2 while drawing level 3. They do not replace one another, but they build on top of one another, so they're progressions, like you might learn in something like calisthenics or gymnastics training. I think that level 3 is the level you will most likely encounter in the vast amounts of media you consume, such as anime and video games. You could, of course, go even further and learn about all the very fine aspects of anatomy, building up to a photorealistic level of detail. But do you really need to do that? The good thing about this 1-2-3 LOD system is that it gets you to a decent level as fast as possible. And the logical progression makes it very straightforward to jump back and forth to check your knowledge anytime you feel a bit rusty. It's pretty much the way that Tom Fox approaches drawing anatomy, and I'd recommend it. But remember, as discussed earlier in this video, to check what you learn against real observed anatomy as well, or else you'll build bad habits like I have. One way I've been trying to do this for the last 100 hours was to invest in some anatomical models. The first was this skull, which I got from Amazon, and it's quite a detailed 3D print with a movable jaw. Make sure you hold it quite far away from you when you draw it, otherwise the closeness to your eyes will cause it to bulge and distort a bit when you draw it, like drawing a person's face from 2 inches away. We need distance to flatten things out. Those of you who understand how the cone of vision works will know what I mean here. While I found this useful for things like general proportions, level 1 and 2 studies, it lacked the features, and I was having to guess where the eyeballs were placed, or the nose and lips, or how the cheeks were built out. And so I got another model from a Chinese company, also via Amazon, and it features all the planes of the head in that PS1 graphics planar style, which helps a lot when trying to work out the level 2 planar studies. I'm still not actually convinced 100% that all the proportions are accurate. The rear of the skull seems a little bit flat, but I think as long as you remember that proportions have a tolerance, you should be fine. Hopefully these tools will continue to help me with unlearning my bad habits and using observation and imagination to tighten up on things like how the far eye actually looks. I was also recently recommended to draw myself using a mirror, so I'll try that as well at some point. I think that studying anatomy has become a battle between what I think I know and what I see, and trying to internalize something in the middle. There is one more aspect to this which I want to mention quickly, and that's the idea of stylization. I'm still studying quite realistic anatomy, as do many artists, but then we go and draw figures like this, or like this, that bear little resemblance to real humans. These are stylized figures. The actual word for this stylization is transposition. I recently attempted to paint a photorealistic portrait and capture a likeness, and for some, this represents the pinnacle of artistic skill, like those graphite artists who can perfectly recreate photos over countless hours. I actually would prefer to draw characters like the ones shown here, and so I have to be able to adapt the anatomy I learn and the things I see to make things I can imagine in my head. Pantography is when we try and capture reality exactly as we see it, And transposition is where we alter reality to make it more visually interesting or to emphasize something specific we wish to draw attention to. Anatomy exists on a sliding scale of representation, and you need to work out where you sit on that scale. I like the idea of being somewhere on the detailed end, but with enough flair and visual interest to make my work look something like the artists you can see on screen right now. Think about this sliding scale as running from very abstract and perhaps even childish depictions of the human figure to the most photorealistic work imaginable. Every artist needs to sit somewhere on this scale, and so you need to figure out where you sit, and that will help you find your style. Interestingly, I found that working higher up the scale, towards the more photorealistic end, actually makes it easier to draw the more stylized lower end stuff, but the reverse does not seem to be true. As such, using the 1-2-3 anatomy system will get you far enough up this scale that you can then reduce the level of detail as appropriate and hopefully produce the kind of art you really want to when it comes to working on things like that manga story you always wanted to draw. Part of my ultimate goal is to be able to paint from imagination, and yet I currently only produce finished painting, as in longer than a simple 1-hour study, every so often. And a part of this is that I don't really have many ideas for paintings. I've been looking for exercises to help me in generating ideas or in planning out how to express ideas generated by things like art prompt bots. Composition can be a bit of a difficult thing to wrap your head around because honestly, it's quite an open area of study, and there are infinite ways to represent any single idea or scene. This makes it difficult to pin down and study sometimes because it's such an abstract concept. A very helpful exercise I found comes from Andrew Loomis and his book Creative Illustration and deals with the difference between what he calls formal and informal composition. When we divide up a canvas, if we want the final image to feature a lot of structure and unity, we can make grids on the canvas initially, and Loomis does this by dividing the area up arbitrarily, mostly with diagonal lines. These linear patterns can be used to help place and align the elements of your piece, and the structure created by the lines will be retained and suggested in the final painting. Another example of this more formal composition is using things like basic geometric shapes, or even letters of the alphabet, to create a simple and highly organized layout. It's actually not something I see that often when looking at the work of other artists, but you do sometimes see it on things like movie posters, and it's very common if you look at more things like graphic design, where information has to be organized logically and creatively. The opposite of this is informal composition. Now, this doesn't mean that we can just draw things wherever we want, although you might choose to do that. But instead we arbitrarily use diagonals to make more asymmetric grids and lines, which do not feature anywhere near as much logical structure or design. This creates a much looser set of guidelines instead of a more rigid grid that we can use as a suggestion for where to place elements of the artwork and guide the eye around. This is much more commonly found when reverse engineering the way that paintings you like have been constructed. I like to think that the layouts and compositions were actually considered in this way first and the characters added, but actually I've found that sometimes it's best to actually draw whatever you want, say the main character roughly in position where you wish for them to be, and then construct the informal grid from that character. You can then place other elements in relation to them, or even adjust their pose or scale to make the composition work a bit better. The best thing about these sorts of exercises is that they can be performed very quickly, and you can sketch out dozens of thumbnails playing with this stuff inside of 1 hour, or deconstruct paintings that you like in the same time frame. I found that it's helped to broaden my awareness of how I could go about constructing my own original pieces. There aren't really any right or wrong answers, but the general process of doing this makes me much more comfortable playing with different ways to frame the scene I have in my imagination or that I have been prompted to draw. On a slightly separate note, there is another exercise in the book which encourages you to spot cool compositions and arrangements of objects you like using a 3x4-inch cardboard viewfinder and then sketching them out as simple pencil drawings. This has also been really fun to do, and I've found that I end up looking at mundane objects in new ways and they become the focal point of the shot, and I then draw everything else around that. Something as simple and everyday as my cat's bed on the floor becomes the focal point of the scene, and I consider how to frame it within this little 3x4 window and what's behind it. This also means I'm working overlap and perspective and a whole bunch of other things, and I find I jump between drawing in 2D shapes and 3D perspective when doing this. Learning to see in this way has been beneficial, and it feels very much like practicing photography, but with no camera. Just a sketchbook. Basically, you are arranging and framing the world around you to highlight particular aspects of it, and then presenting those aspects in a way that you think is both logical and interesting. And learning to think and see like this is really fun. I think that moving forward it will be a big puzzle piece that helps me both when drawing from imagination and observation. Let's talk about painting for a bit. I've spent the first 400 hours working mostly in terms of value, and to be honest, I've actually gotten quite good at being able to spot and match values on a simple scale, and to paint scenes in grouped values to make them both simplified and easy to understand. This enables me to paint very complex scenes like landscapes within around 30 minutes at a decent level of detail. A natural progression of this, perhaps influenced by my time studying from observation, has been to focus much more on shape for the last 100 hours. Everything we see can be thought of as a triangle, circle, or square and treated as a symbol. And for landscapes, this is very easy to do because we're usually standing far enough away from the scene that everything in it flattens out. For example, mountains can be drawn as triangles, despite the fact that in real life they're very large, round, or three-dimensional structures. By quickly deciding what shape the scene objects are and capturing the biggest ones in 2 or 3 values, I can then work inside those shapes with smaller shapes and repeat the process. Those of you who can remember me discussing creation cycles last time will understand how this works. I might have to increase the number of values to represent some forms or make the scene lighting as desired, but I always use as few values as possible. Looking for shapes forces you to organize the scene, and the end result is always logical and easy to read. I want to work like this in other areas too, like portraits, not just landscapes. I'm experiencing a degree of frustration in that every landscape image I paint at the moment comes out differently, using a different approach, which I feel is quite common during the learning phase, and then eventually when I start to find little methods of doing things to latch onto, I should get more of a workflow going. That being said, every painting is unique, and often you have to think on your feet as to how to depict the scene in the way you want. Shape has felt like a natural progression from my extensive work on values, and simplifying things has become much easier as a result. I'm still finding my feet, and where each painting has been tackled slightly differently, my work sometimes comes out looking more like an artist such as Rob Rupel, where I've gone really graphic with the shapes and simplification. I don't always mind this, but sometimes it feels more graphic than I would like, and so stylistically I'm feeling like I want to bring in a little more softness and edge control in places. It's changing all the time, but I find it fascinating how my style of painting can change quite quickly as I change my focus to the next area of study. I wonder how much of this style change is due to my natural tendencies as a painter, and how much is due to the constraints that the new areas of study impose upon me. For example, if I'm working on shape, it seems only natural that the end result of a painting will appear more cut out and graphic. But what if that's actually just how I paint naturally? Will my work retain this graphic quality even as I gradually cycle new concepts in? Shape and mapping shapes in general also feels like it's being influenced heavily by bark drawing and drawing from observation, which is also weird because I spend so much time thinking in perspective and in 3 dimensions, but for some reason I'm entering a stage where I'm using a much more 2 dimensional take on things. To make it clear, I am always still thinking in perspective and 3 dimensions, but for certain things like landscapes, I think I can now tell where it might be more effective to lower the level of detail and simplify things into simple flat shapes. I tend to paint in the silhouette first as a big flat shape and then build it out using my understanding of 3 dimensions, assigning values to planes to create a nicely grouped bunch of values that depict the 3 dimensional form. The biggest change in painting is that I finally took the plunge and started working in full color, and this meant spending a lot of time learning about color and light and how they work. Let me start by saying that learning this digitally versus traditionally needs to be considered. When you work digitally in Photoshop, for example, you have a huge amount of colors available, and knowing which ones to use can be a bit overwhelming. When you work traditionally, especially if only using the 3 primaries, you still have access to millions of colors, but you have to mix them yourself. And I think this personally is where the juicy learning opportunity is. Picking a skin tone in Photoshop will net you only a fraction of the education that mixing your own skin tones in gouache will. So while I recommend working both digitally for ease and traditionally for the experience, traditional is my current way to recommend learning about color. Furthermore, you can run experiments with specific pigments as you paint far more easily. I always use white and often black, albeit sparingly, so remember that as we move forward and discuss these color palettes. I've been using an RBY palette for some and a CMY palette for others. So what does that mean? Well, traditionally, most artists mix their colors using red, blue, and yellow, the primary colors, and that's probably what you learned about in school. And using these is great, but there's another set of colors that actually offers a slightly wider array of mixtures, and that's cyan, magenta, and yellow. These colors are basically still just red, blue, and yellow, but they're a version developed in the 1950s for use with commercial printing technologies, because they can create more colors than the traditional primaries can. I personally have found that they have less saturation in the orange range, but a lot more saturation in the purple and green range. And that means that one set of colors might be better for skin tones, for example, while the other favors landscape and greenery. As such, depending on what I'm painting, I might swap out the primary colors I use. Another option for RBY are the colors ultramarine for blue, and then cadmium yellow and cadmium red. Ultimately, whatever you choose, they all do the same thing, but there are subtle differences, and these have been fun to play with and explore. There are other more specific options too, like the Zorn palette, which consists of cadmium red and yellow ochre, along with black and white. That's how the artist Anders Zorn painted a lot of his portraits, using just 2 colors. The 2 color limitation is actually where I've had the most fun so far. This robot, for example, was painted using only blue and orange, and I adjusted them using the saturation and value sliders. This means when I see a color, like the shadows on the legs here, I have to consider their value and whether they are bluer or grayer. I cannot match the colors exactly as they are in the reference, but instead I'm forced to get it as close as possible and that's what makes the final painting look unified and harmonious. The colors work well together because they are opposite ends of the color wheel, and so I have created a pleasing study. The most important aspect of this is the value, which as mentioned I have a lot of experience in now. By carefully adjusting the value slider, checking my work and readjusting, I can eventually create a palette on the painting I can pick from. In fact, much like my value studies use only 4 or 5 values, there are probably only around 7 colors here on this robot painting, and I can just color pick from the painting and add a little of this color or that color to other areas with a pressure sensitive brush. Color picking is something that a lot of you guys have disliked. I've shared some time-lapse videos these past 100 hours that show me picking the colors from the reference photo, and a lot of people called me out on it. Quite rightly, you state that I would learn far more about color by not doing so and matching the colors by eye. But I encountered a problem when painting in color in the beginning. I found color matching manually to be doable, but it required a lot of focus and concentration. And so when I was working on shape, another area of focus these last 100 hours, I ended up actually focusing on color instead. What was happening is I was spending too much time trying to make the colors perfect, and so completely forgot about shape and ended up losing all focus. Part of the meta-learning protocol I'm currently using is to focus on just one key area of improvement per study. And so to eliminate thinking about color and to encourage working on shape, I use the color picker. So you see, I wasn't really cheating so much as deliberately applying constraints to force me to focus on the things I wanted to improve at for that single session. As you can see, when working on color as a topic of study, I do things the hard way, and the color picker is only used to check my work. Color has been really fun so far, and even just using different blacks and whites to mix various shades of grey has provided hours of interesting results. When working in gouache, you can make greys by thinning black paint, or by mixing black and white paint, or by using actual grey paint from a tube, or even by mixing together opposing hues to make greys that way. Each one is slightly warmer or slightly cooler or thicker and thinner, and it's just so much fun to play with. Every time I make a study like this, I use my Anki cards as a digital journal to record my findings, and these provide the starting point the next time the flashcard comes up, so that I can pick up and carry on my ideas from where I left off. One more thing that I wanted to mention is that in an effort to learn more about how other artists paint and draw, I recently started undertaking master studies, and I'm developing an entire 10K approach to this, which I hope to share in an upcoming video. I have a whole bunch of ways that I think about and recreate the studies I paint from, but I'll give a brief overview of the main findings I have so far. Firstly, if you find a piece you want to study, it's important to recreate it ideally in the same media as it was painted in. This is not strictly necessary, but if you try and recreate a digital piece in gouache, you'll likely end up disappointed. Similarly, beautiful watercolor washes like the one seen here are not that easy to recreate digitally, so know your media. Secondly is that size matters. I tend to work quite small, but have found that it's impossible to really recreate the works in the way that the painter did unless you can actually match them for scale sometimes. It depends exactly what you want to study from the master copy, but the size of your work might have to be quite large to study some aspects like recreating particular brush marks. The third is repetition. You know that repetition is something I'm a big advocate of, and it forms the backbone of most of my meta-learning work, but it's just as important for master studies. Master studies were originally done to try and embody the spirit of a painter you like, and you'll get a lot more from painting the same image 10 times than you will from doing it one time. Every time I paint some of the works I studied, I learned something new. For example, Fairfield Porter seems to favour frontlit scenes, and this means he can use big flat shapes of colour, a lot like how I work in shape and value, and so this is probably something that has influenced my work a lot in these last 100 hours. Anders Zorn painted with the Zorn palette that we talked about earlier, but he also allowed himself a single green to offset the Zorn palette, which usually appears somewhere in the painting, like here on the necktie. While it's not possible for studying classic artists like Zorn or Porter, more modern artists have another element to consider which is highly important for meta-learning, and that's video footage, and the ability to reach out to them and ask them questions. One of the artists I studied recently was Yongchang Li, who is a current living artist that paints really wonderful landscapes, and I couldn't work out how the paintings he creates have such a richness of texture and depth. I discovered that he has a YouTube channel, and he shares the process of painting some of the actual paintings I was studying over there. I watched these at a reduced speed, and I tried to reverse engineer the way he actually works, and it turns out he's really just creating these big textured shapes and stamping them around before working into them. That was a huge piece of the puzzle, and it's something I need to experiment with and bring into my own work once I start painting more of my own imaginary landscapes in the future. I haven't personally had much luck with asking artists questions in the past. I've tried to reach out to a few before, but they rarely reply. And that's fine, by the way, as I imagine they get bombarded with questions and offers daily. But if you can respectfully speak with an artist or ask them a question about how they work, I find it can go a long way in helping you to understand their process and thinking. Just be respectful and understand if they cannot reply. There's something important I need to address going forward, and it's in response to some well-deserved criticism that I received in the last video regarding the term neuroscience. You see, I've been using neuroscience as a catch-all term and buzzword to describe the sort of approach I have to learning. And the reason for this is mostly due to the fact that real estate on YouTube video titles is very limited, and so I felt I needed to use some clickbaity buzzword term to quickly get across what I did. And neuroscience, which is used in this way by others, seemed like a good way to get this across. But as some have pointed out, it's not correctly using the term, and they've warned me that this could lead to long-term confusion and possibly even damage to the fields as the channel grows in size and people begin using the wrong terms to describe things. So we're going to define some terms and look a bit deeper at what I'm actually doing here. Firstly, neuroscience specifically is the study of the brain and the nervous system. And some of what I do is certainly performed as a result of looking into neuroscientific studies, but it's not strictly speaking neuroscience. I have an interest in the subject, but I am not a scientist myself. To say that I am learning art using neuroscience is actually not an accurate description, and that's what I need to fix today. Instead, please think of me as using some of the findings of neuroscientists as the basis for what I do. You could say that I am experimenting with the findings of various cognitive science fields to test their effectiveness in learning art, and that would be a more accurate description of what I do, but a worse YouTube video title. Marketing sucks, kids, but it's more important to prevent damage to a scientific field than to get clicks and views, so from now on you'll see these changes reflected in this and future video releases. The cognitive scientists are clever enough to have figured out how the brain physically learns, and what I do is more at the other end of the table, using those findings to anecdotally test ways of using that information to try and speed up skill acquisition. What I do could better be described as meta-learning. Other terms for this include ultra-learning or speed learning or accelerated learning, and I've been doing it since around 2016 to learn languages, coding, mathematics, origami, and a few other things that I've never discussed on this channel. I decided to try and adapt it for learning to draw in 2020 very briefly during the COVID lockdowns. I was so impressed with the results that I started again, revisiting it in 2023, and that's how I started this channel. Painting and drawing are the first procedurally learned skills that I've tried learning like this, and that's what this experiment is really about. Because it's totally different to learning something like Spanish vocabulary or how to write a for loop in Python. Meta-learning means to learn about learning. And the idea is that by using smart approaches inspired by what neuroscientists and other cognitive experts like psychologists have uncovered, you can learn how you learn personally and observe your progress and course correct and hopefully learn the desired skill in a much faster time frame than someone who uses more traditional learning frameworks. The 10,000 hours name is a play on words because it does not take 10,000 hours to actually become good at something. That's a myth. It might take 10,000 hours to break into the top 1% of practitioners, but meta-learners try to get good enough in a fraction of that time by breaking into, say, the top 10% of world practitioners. Sometimes this involves looking at what the top 1% of practitioners do, but often it actually involves studying those much further down the skill ladder and looking at learning from new angles and developing new techniques to try and get where you want to go much faster than most learners would typically experience. Related fields that also influence what I do include psychology, anthropology, and pedagogy. There's also the term autodidacticism, which means self-learning, and that's really just referring to how I am teaching myself the skills through books and other resources coupled with these meta-learning techniques. You can best think of this channel then as examining the science of learning, specifically through the lens of learning art, and we're best to define these learning sciences as the cognitive sciences. So the channel video titles and video introductions will reflect this from now on. If this sounds confusing or you're just curious about learning more, I hope to produce some more videos in the near future that will discuss some of these meta-learning principles in much more detail so you can understand them more thoroughly, see how I apply them, and see how to run them in your own experiments. Here's what I traditionally painted and drew for the last 100 hours. I actually had a ridiculous schedule at my day job for most of these last 100 hours, working weekends and sometimes evenings, meaning that although I did still always manage to put in 1 hour a day, there were a lot of times where I didn't feel like I learned a lot. My job is very physical. I actually work in construction for film and TV, and I have to wake up at 4:30 a.m. every day. So after a long day and then a 2-hour drive home, I find that I don't learn a lot, and sometimes have to actually get around this by scheduling cards that I find a lot easier to do. I felt that my level of tiredness was sometimes reflected in the lower quality of the drawings I produced, and on any days I did have off work, I tried to do my 1 hour study in the morning when I was feeling refreshed and found it far easier to summon the amount of focus and concentration required to actually internalize things. The main thing that suffered really was the video production for this channel, and the repaints I have for things like the Street Fighter image are done, but the videos are not made yet. Hopefully you can understand that I only have so much free time, juggling this channel and work and family, so please know that I have a lot of ideas for videos I'm excited to make, but they're going to take some time to produce. I managed to fill a good half of this massive thick sketchbook, and I also produced a whole bunch of digital studies and some traditional paintings in a little watercolor pad. I also tried some new materials this time. The sketchbook I've been using is by Shaw and Marsh, and it actually takes water-based media really well, so I've been using gouache in it too. It has a little tooth that makes it really nice to use pencil and ballpoint pens in as well. Another thing I tried was the legendary Blackwing pencils. These pencils have a cult following, but they're expensive, and I found a really cool small company here in the UK called The Stationer that offers a sample set. There are 4 types of Blackwing pencil available, and you get one of each for a fraction of the cost it would set you back buying a whole set of just one type. I'm not affiliated with this vendor in any way, but I'm going to place a link to them in the description because I thought it was such a good idea for those curious about trying otherwise expensive new materials. The CMY gouache I found was by Schminker Academy, and I found these paints to be very good. They aren't as thick as the Winsor Newton gouache paints, but the colours are just as punchy, and they cover well and mix well. I'll also include links in the description to the skull and planar head models that I got from Amazon. I bought another very cheap plastic skeleton model to try and use for drawing things like the ribcage, but its proportions are very inaccurate. Most skeleton models are either very nasty, cheap Halloween decorations or very expensive, very large medical-grade skeletons. I don't know why there isn't an in-between, or why there aren't any creators on Etsy or some similar website selling 3D printed bones and body parts. It seems like a market nobody's tried to capture yet, but I'd certainly buy a little 3D printed anatomically correct ribcage or skeleton model to help me draw better. Another paint that I started using for a couple of value studies was System 3 acrylic. This is good because it dries faster and works a bit more like marker pens in terms of opacity, meaning you can paint in the shapes mentioned in this video, painting very quickly, and then go back over shapes you want to adjust by repainting. Acrylic is a little thick and textured for my liking, and yet when I thin it, it goes too watery and streaky. I think I just need to learn the technical aspects of it a bit better, but System 3 is certainly very high quality, and it works well for what I wish to use it for. I only use black and white currently, but it seems it's best to use a throwaway paper palette like the tear-off ones because it doesn't wash out on the palette once dry, and it can potentially degrade your brushes, so be careful what you use it with. I have some cheap synthetic bristle brushes that work well with it, and I'm sure to wash them out thoroughly with cold water at the end of a session. I feel like the last 100 hours were fraught with frustrations, and that my drawing had to really be reanalyzed to figure out how to make more progress as I plateau. But in newer fields like painting in color or working on composition, huge gains were made. This seems quite common in most things that I have learned in the past, and I like it because it forces me to come up with innovative new angles to look at learning from and to try and jumpstart my progression again. The stack is getting much bigger every time. I'm only 5% of the way through my desired output so far, and it's already starting to look like a phone book. For the next 100 hours, I will be working more on color to try and build upon what I'm learning and what I already know, producing more master studies to try and learn how some of the artists I admire use paint or lines to achieve such a high level of work. I have some more art books that I want to scan and bring into circulation to pad a few more things out. I'm also going to be spending more time just drawing from observation and sketching out my own ideas and maintaining a new sketchbook specifically for that to try some new things outside the scope of this experiment. So that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Hopefully there was something in there that you found interesting or were able to relate to as either a fellow student or as someone who's dealt with this stuff in your formative years as an artist. Feel free to let me know any advice or criticisms that you have or to share your own experience, as that's such an important part to how we all learn. The Discord server is still up and available for anyone who wants to study with like-minded individuals a little every day too, with an invite link in the description. I'll be back hopefully very soon with some more repaint videos, the one about teaching as a learning method, and hopefully some more new material to expand upon how I go about using meta-learning to study art.